the need for safety in some form. Because I think when you challenge a defence like disavow head on, you either get this very angry response, or at the point at which somebody is letting go of it, you get a kind of collapse. And what you were describing was a kind of personal collapse that happened to you at the point where, in a way, you separated yourself from your professional approach to this, and you started to look at what you felt, what you thought it meant. And I think at that moment, those moments of personal collapse in the research which Paul and I did, we referred to that as the stage of immersion. And it was a stage where people would immerse themselves both in the facts of everything they could find out about climate change, but also in the emotions of what that did. And so people would be describing those initial responses were shock, disbelief, feeling overwhelmed, feeling panicked, feeling angry, feeling guilty, feeling powerless, feeling despair. A lot of very, very powerful negative emotion. I remember one chap talking to me about how he was walking through the supermarket and he couldn't understand how anybody could possibly be going shopping, because it no longer made sense to him, the sort of ordinary things of life, rather the way that you can feel when you've just experienced news of a death of somebody. So I think that stage of immersion that people enter into is very critical, and the way that they come out of it is very critical, because there are other defences that can come into play during that stage of immersion. So. And I think what you're describing when you in your paper is that one of the routes out of that you took was if I've got you right, was a sort of reaffirmation of spiritual practice that was important to you at that point.
Yes.
Yeah, that was the road for you out of that point.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So my reading of the latest climate science and data, like real-time measurements, meant that suddenly my own death seemed much more imminent. Don't know when, but it seemed imminent. And also a death of loved ones. And also this, it's almost like, I don't know if there's a psychological term for it, some kind of deeper, wider death of anyone and anything I could contribute to. So a loss of that sense of buttressing of the self through contribution to culture and to progress. So yeah, all that was going on, and therefore one way out of that is to tune into my past experiences that you might call transcendent or mystical, as well as looking to those who for them that's a real day-to-day lived reality, whether that's in explicitly religious ways or whether it's certain types of more transpersonal psychosynthesis in this field. I started opening up to that. And I mention it a tiny bit in the paper. But there's not too much love and God in my paper. That came later.
But it seemed to me that the seeds of that were there in that paper, and that that's if you were to look at what your personal journey would be, it would be that was the route out. It was into spiritual practice, and it sounds to me from the little bits of your work that I've looked at since that is actually perhaps the most important part of it for you personally, is that spiritual path.
And then at the same time that doesn't provide easy answers, because one way of responding to that would be to retreat from public life. I don't meditate very well. I haven't read all the spiritual classics I'd love to read. I'm not part of a religious community of any sort. So I could focus on that, and I think I would have done. But with the paper going world famous, and suddenly floods of people getting in touch with expressing very difficult emotions, I could say maybe I fell back on my old responsibility story or obligation story about it's good to be useful in the world, and therefore I've building this deep adaptation forum and working as hard as I've done for years, trying to build this up, and within that there's groups on counselling, there's groups on food, community action, activism. So the spirituality is big, but I'm very engaged. It's very practical. How do we get funding for the forum? How do we train moderators? How do we provide emotional backup support for our staff? And it's all become like that.
I think one of the things which is I think I also see in the journey is the sense of, at that point of the immersion, there are a number of tasks that I think appear to people. I've actually written them down because I don't remember things like I used to, but the ones I've got down were, and which I think are echoed in your journey, Jem, are the mourning the life path that cannot continue and will be lost. Reshaping a sense of identity in the face of this, finding support and solidarity with others, and choosing a path of action. And I think those are both psychological and practical tasks that confront people in this stage which Paul and I call immersion in the paper we wrote. And I think they are things which people find different ways out of. But
this is really good. I'm discovering I'm just a normal human. Super. Happened here right now.
And I mean, I think amongst the people who Paul and I were interviewing, the path which they were choosing was mainly direct action. And that's not necessarily a path that everybody wants to take, but the sense of needing to find a pathway out of your confrontation with the reality of climate change, I think is very strong. And so the question of, I think at the moment, I mean, just go back for a moment to Chris's question, what's different at the moment? Is there are a lot more people who I think are facing that epiphany, that state of immersion, the need to actually confront those extremely painful emotions and those difficult tasks and find a way out of it without employing other defences in order to manage being there. I think that's quite a big task, and it sort of comes back to this question of how to provide containment, because I think that what you're describing is having been asked to provide containment for all sorts of feelings that were bombarding you, and some of them were people's desperation and distress, and some of them were for people who reacted angrily and aggressively because of that distress. And some of them may, in fact, just have been people who disagreed with you, which of course is always possible, and one needs to recognise that can also be there. So I think that what I saw was you as somebody who thought you'd written a rather perhaps off-the-wall academic paper, finding yourself in a position of needing to cope with a lot of quite complex psychological experiences which were outside your comfort zone. Would that be?
Yes, and it's fascinating. So I had to hire an executive assistant to cope with all the contact I was getting, and just also seeing the way people would respond when Matthew would write back to people saying, Jem is not an expert on collapse or all the multifarious implications, practical and psychological, and he wishes to direct people to other people who have particular expertise, so please get in touch with, and he would have a whole bunch of people to list, and some people would express outrage that they want to talk to me. How dare Matthew say that? And so it's all been quite interesting on many levels.
So you also found yourself moving from being a quiet professor in a small university, to being a kind of almost a sort of media star with all kinds of fantasy projected onto you of what you might be able to help with.
If I have the answers,
if you have the answers.
If I can help people with how they're processing this.
Yeah.
So the answer is there's many people in this situation out there, and there are ways to get in touch with each other. Yes.
Maybe it might be useful to talk a little bit about psychotherapeutic ideas about containment and safety, which is something which I spent a lot of time thinking about, because what the situation in which psychotherapy provides safety is the consulting room, which may be an individual or maybe a group situation. It's a situation in which people have come voluntarily. And the safety is provided by the boundaries of that setting and by the professional training of the therapist. And what you're trying to do is to initially provide this sort of what we call the holding environment, in which the patient will feel safe enough to explore things which they've previously defended themselves against very powerfully. But you're also trying to develop inside the person the capacity to contain difficult and distressing experiences themselves. And so a lot of our experience comes from these quite formal situations of providing safety. And the safe space that psychotherapy provides is also quite a challenging space. It's not a space where you agree with everything that your patient says. You're there to explore what they bring. So it's also a difficult space. It's not the safe space which you hear talked about and mocked. When people talk about snowflake students not wanting to know platform speakers. That's not what we're talking about at all. It's actually about a place that's psychologically safe enough to do some very difficult work. But then, of course, the question comes, as I and other people in this profession have talked about the creation of these safe spaces. Well, how do you do them? How do you do this publicly? How do you do this in situations where you don't have that contract? And there's been quite a lot of exploration, I think, amongst people within the Climate Psychology Alliance and in things which I myself and other people have written. And it was the idea behind the Carbon Conversations groups, which I set up in 2006 with Andy Brown, and which have been used in various places. These were facilitated groups. We had the hope that we could train a lot of ordinary people to facilitate them, but what you actually find is it's quite difficult to get the skilled facilitation to them. So I think there's a big question about how we deal socially and politically with very, very difficult emotion. And I can talk a bit more about that, but I think it's time for you to come back in.
Oh, I'd love to hear about that, because that's the work I'm involved in. One of the big things that happened is obviously Extinction Rebellion. And did I just hear a whoop? Yes. Monday, 11 a.m, Oxford Circus. I'm opening, I'm the first speaker. I have to be slightly upbeat. Go home. Hug your family, hug your kids. Yeah. Well, it has to be a funny side. So, I'm very interested in that, about how do we, in a public sphere, day to day, not in a clinical setup, or a counselling setup, look for containment and providing at least a safe enough context for very difficult conversations. And I'd love to hear from all of you about ideas on that. But yeah, Extinction Rebellion, I had no idea that the response to sort of the reports and the Northern Hemisphere weather of 2018 would lead to people talking about civil disobedience and getting arrested. That wasn't the first thing on my mind. I remember when I first heard about it from friends in Totnes. It took a while to get my head around it, but then And then Stina Rathor, who was at my conference in September, and in my workshop where I gave my first speech after the paper came out, she's right at the heart of it. Her best mate is Gail Bradbrook, so she went straight home after that conference and volunteered to help launch that. And I'm impressed because okay, they've chosen civil disobedience as the method, but they're very focused on the emotional side and the grief and the love, and so they have these regular grief circles online, and publicly grieving is in their meetings is there. So I think it's an interesting basis for whatever comes next. I don't share the view that people being arrested will actually bring down the government and bring down capitalism and so on. But yeah.
I think this was I was challenged some years ago by climate scientists who said, well, it's all very well the way you talk about safety, but I'm having to stand up in front of lots of people. I'm having to appear on the radio. I'm having to do this, this and that. How do I go about it? So I was floored, as one is sometimes when one encounters this sort of challenge. But what I did, and I've got some written material about this, so I won't go into huge detail here, but I went back to look at what people do who provide that sort of safety, and I looked at the speeches of Winston Churchill and of Martin Luther King, which were very, very interesting, and I may have just made a quick enough note of that to be able just to say something very, very briefly about it, because both Churchill and Martin Luther King create a space in which the audience can listen to very, very, very difficult truths. And one of the key things which Churchill does, I looked at his speeches, which followed the huge defeat in 1940. The events that are known in the British imagination as Dunkirk, but were actually the most massive defeat in British military history. And he tells the truth about this. He says it was a terrible defeat. I've got the quotes somewhere, I can read them to you if you really wanted to hear them. But he absolutely tells the truth, and this is one of the remarkable things about it. King does the same thing. But he also uses storytelling and emotion and metaphor to connect with the audience, which King does much better than Churchill. He's a much more emotional speaker. And they're also very, very clear about the difference between responsibility and blame, which I think is hugely important in public speech. So they allocate responsibility, but they don't go into blame. And they're explicit about the ask, about what they want people to do. And so that's a very brief summary of it. And I think there's perhaps quite a lot to be learned from looking at some of these uses of the way that leadership can provide some of that containment. It obviously can't provide all of it, but I think there are particular ways of speaking that help, and particular ways of speaking that don't when we're asked to speak in public. So that's just a few words on that, because I think it's a very important issue for anybody who's asked to go and speak about climate change, is to be able to think about the effect that you're having on the audience. And smaller situations like the one we're in here, there's all kinds of opportunities for creating space for people to talk amongst themselves about what they've heard. So I think this question of safety is a big one.
So Ro, I'd like to turn the tables.
Yes.
You are one of the leading psychologists looking at climate and activism, and I'm 20. Basically, since July, every 2 weeks, there is another terrifying report coming out. as well as obviously every day new news about what's happening. So although our mass media may not say that 20 degrees in the middle of winter, 70 Fahrenheit, is not sort of like inviting apocalyptic discussions. I'm wondering how the shift that seems to be underway, how you're responding to it.
Right. I think one of the, I suppose my own story goes back to having got involved in climate issues in a serious way about 2004. And this is my moment of letting go of the state of disavowal. I knew about climate change, everybody knew about climate change. But actually allowing it to become real for me. And I think I was very, very intensely involved in a lot of activity in that period between 2004 and the Copenhagen Climate Summit in 2009. And I think for me, like for a lot of people, the outcome of Copenhagen was devastating. Not because any of us thought that it was going to deliver what we wanted, but because we thought it was going to deliver something that would create a space in which we could continue to work. And I think that the three events of the 2008 financial crash, and the Copenhagen Summit, and the election of a Conservative government in 2010, kicked climate change out of public conversation very, very severely and rapidly. And I think that for a lot of people, myself included, that was a time of really great depression and struggle to reorient around what to do at that time. And one of the things which I think had always been true for me was that in my own journey down this road, a lot of the early discussions had contained a conversation about, well, what if we don't succeed? What if we can't stop this? What if we do get to the point of various kinds of collapse? And I think that what for me came out of those conversations was, well, you keep on doing what you think is right. And I think that we found this also. When Paul and I interviewed the activists, we found that really what kept them going was the fact, not necessarily the fact that they thought they were going to change the world or they were going to succeed, but that once you knew what you knew, it was no longer possible to carry on as you carried on before. So you lived your life differently. And for most of those, that meant they also adopted, very low impact lives, because it no longer made sense to be getting on an aeroplane or eating a lot of meat or whatever. But so their lives changed, and I think that was also true for me. But the other part of it was that in order to be able to do this, and in order to be able to carry on with life, I stopped reading everything. The exit from that state of immersion is to say, I know enough. I know it's extremely dangerous. I know it's absolutely desperate. I know it's getting worse. I do not any longer need to follow the newsfeed. I actually need to get on with doing the things which I have decided are my path of action, whatever that is, and I need to live life in all of the ways that make it meaningful for me. And so my reaction to the recent weather events, climate events, and to the upsurge of distress about that, and the upsurge of information and participation in things has been to go, well, that's great to see this. I'm still in my position of saying, yeah, it's dangerous. I've known this for a long, long time. I don't actually want to enter that stage of panic and distress again, because it's not useful to me. I've been through that, and I've come out the other side to where I want to act. And I think that's still where I am.
It's fascinating, because that's also the idea behind this positive deep adaptation Facebook group that I launched about a month ago, which is that one of the guidelines for people to join is not to post news on how bad the climate is, or how famous people now agree how bad it is. It's actually you join it with a starting point that you have accepted that a form of societal collapse is likely or is already underway in certain places, and it's then what? And that actually posting to Facebook something about forest fires in California or the amount of heat in the oceans, to me begins to feel like I don't know, is there a term for it? But it seems like a way of feeling like you're doing something without doing anything. And it's in the realm of blame. And it's in the realm of sort of wake up, well, it's all your fault, rather than just living with your own truth.
I mean, I think that's very interesting, because the other part of the work that I've done around the immersion, what I call the immersion phase, is about what are the defensive outcomes from that. You know, if you actually land in the immersion phase and it's overwhelmed you and you're panicked, where do you go? And it was the work that Paul and I did on this immersion phase that for me made sense of experiences I had with people much earlier on. And I think it has a lot to do with a very painful state, which is a masochistic defense. So that people become very preoccupied with the science. They can't move out of this immersion state. They clock every next development. And they torture themselves with this. And so it's a form of self-torture. And it can come from guilt. It can come from the sense that one has been horribly implicated. It can come from a sense that you can't find a way out of your current way of living. It can come from a lack of courage. It can come from an unwillingness to actually do anything more than know about climate change. And I encountered it a lot when I was running a community group amongst people who were working. Often they've been appointed green champions in the workplace, something I'm sure Jem from his CSR work is very familiar with. And these poor souls were lumbered with being conscious of their workplace. And they reacted first masochistically and then sadistically. And so then you become, in order to expel some of this self-torture, you slide into torturing others. And then, of course, you're in awful downhill slopes. And so I think there are real risks when things are not contained safely enough and people are not supported and helped through this immersion phase of becoming stuck in these ways. So it sounds like that's really bells for you.
You mentioned, it's wonderful, you talk like I read, sometimes. You mentioned a whole range of different reasons why people would be stuck in that masochistic mode. And I didn't write them down fast enough. It's quite a few things there that made sense to me.
Right, so in a way I think what you're encountering is you're seeing people on this journey, and I think it's often quite hard to make sense of some of the experiences that people have on that very, very painful, difficult journey.
Wow. So, we're coming. How long are we going to have here?
Well, maybe this is a great moment for a pause and for the conversation to continue amongst us. Would that be all right?
Yes, and there's a few things I'd like to say as well. But
yeah, we'll have a chance to come back.
We could come back and we could talk about them.
So if we take about 10-15 minutes to talk with the people next to you, and then whenever you're ready, take a break, and we'll start again at 11:30 back together here. Okay? So you'd like to turn to your neighbours and discuss what you've been hearing.
use it here because people know what I mean. It's often used as an insult. And so I think one has to be quite careful how you use it. But it's describing a state of what I describe in terms of it's a state of self-torture where you confuse knowing with doing. And it arises in life and guilt about the life you've led. It can arise from guilt about and fear about the world that your children are going to live in. It can arise from an unwillingness to actually really make any change. A lot of problems. And I think the only way to discover this through conversation with people. And I think one of the problems about a lot of online communication is its speed. And there's some things that I didn't really manage to get in about safety. But it's about what you're doing is you're creating a space for reflective thought. And it's very hard to do that online because it requires pauses, it requires a lot of exploration. And the online world is a very weaponized world. It's a world of action and reaction. And it's not a place in many ways
I feel a bit sorry for our moderators because we have to delete so many messages that are just climate doom. And even though it says in the sign-up questions you agree not to be sharing that, you're not about that. People get quite angry and then complain to the moderators.